So reading from Zechariah chapter 12 verses 1 to 9. This is the word of the Lord concerning Israel, the Lord who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundation of the earth, and who forms the spirit of man within him declares, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. On that day when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves. On that day I will strike every horse with panic, and its rider with madness, declares the Lord. I will keep a watchful eye over the house of Judah, but I will blind all the horses of the nations. Then the leaders of Judah will say in their hearts, the people of Jerusalem are strong, because the Lord Almighty is their God. On that day I will make the leaders of Judah like a firepot in a woodpile, like a flaming torch among sheaves, and they will consume right and left all the surrounding peoples, but Jerusalem will remain intact in her place. The Lord will save the dwellings of Judah first, so that the honour of the house of David and of Jerusalem's inhabitants may not be greater than that of Judah. On that day the Lord will shield those who live in Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. On that day I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. So far, the prophecy of Zechariah has looked at events up to the first coming of the Messiah, Jesus, and his rejection by the Jews. For these last three remaining chapters, the attention turns to what happens afterwards. So if you like, they relate to the experience of the church in our age through to the end of time and Jesus' second coming. And obviously a key question is, when will these things take place? Well, the phrase "on that day" occurs 15 times in these chapters, and many commentators think that that's a reference to the second coming of Jesus. However, in Hebrew, day has a variety of meanings, one of which means a single period of time, no matter how long it lasts. The phrase means a point when God will intervene in the life of the world, and it may take place at any time during that period. Now, all that we read about in these chapters will come about as a result of the work of the Good Shepherd. Some are positive, some are negative. But rest assured, it's saying, God will intervene. And that in itself is a message of encouragement for us. Those times perhaps when we look at the state of the church, we get nervous, or we panic, or we're frustrated, God will intervene. But as difficult as these next few chapters are for us to understand, we need to remember Romans chapter 15 verse 4. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. So the words we're reading today and thinking about today are written for our encouragement and to give us hope. The passage begins with three statements about God. He's showing us no matter how we may feel about God's character, his actions are unchanging. Verse 1, the Lord who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundations of the earth, and who forms the human spirit within a person. And that's telling us the Lord, and that's someone who's in a relationship with them, the people of Israel, and with us. He is the one who created the universe and so is able to control it. Second, this control goes far beyond innate objects or animals, because third statement, the hearts or the spirits of all mankind are in his hands, just as those of kings are. You know, our God cannot be overthrown. No obstacle will stop him. That's how great he is. So, having reminded us of just what a great God we have, we're then told what God will do. And Zechariah uses 5 pictures for this. 4 of those pictures are about what God will do against his enemies. And 1 picture is applicable to us. The first picture is a cup, verses 1 and 2. Behold, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. Now, in the Old Testament, the image of a cup of wine or strong drink is a common picture of God's wrath, his anger. It has the idea of being forced to drink and then getting drunk on the full measure of God's anger, which leaves you staggering, not enjoying the experience, rather feeling the full weight of God's condemnation. Second picture, verse 3, is that of a heavy stone. On the day when God judges, that's what it's going to be like for God's enemies as they gather against God's people. Now, to Zechariah's original hearers, this would have been really exciting news. Remember, after the days of David and Solomon, the nations had gathered, they'd attacked Jerusalem and won. God's people, they'd recently spent 70 years in exile. But Zechariah's message to God's people is, hey, the tables are going to be turned. Fortunes are going to be reversed. Now, the interesting thing is, if we read this verse closely, God doesn't say, I will throw a heavy stone on all the peoples, which is what you might expect. You would expect God to judge the nations directly. But instead he says, on that day, I will make Jerusalem, God's people, a heavy stone for all the peoples. So God will use his people as an instrument of his judgment against the surrounding nations. In the future, the nations will gather against God's people, they will attack, and they will lose. A reverse. The next picture is that of horses, verses 4 and 5. And horses are a symbol of military might. On that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic and its riders with madness. But for the sake of the house of Judah, I will keep my eyes open when I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. Verse 4 is a vivid picture of God's future judgment when God's enemies will panic and be destroyed. On that day, they will see that God protects his people like the apple of his eye. And God's people will know it too. Verse 6, the next image is that of a blazing pot. A blazing pot was basically a fire pan made of gold or bronze, which was used to carry hot coals. The hot coals were transferred to and from the altars of the tabernacle and the temple. They were used for sacrifices. Verses 6 and 7. On that day I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of wood, like a flaming torch among sheaves. They shall devour to the right and to the left all the surrounding peoples, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place. In Jerusalem. If you like, there are two similar pictures there. The blazing pot in the midst of wood, and a flaming torch amongst sheaves. So the blazing pot, hot coals on wood, flaming torch, fire on dried plants. A picture. Fire plus fuel equals destruction. The picture of a fire pot is this vivid picture of judgment. God's enemies may gather against God's people, but in the future, through God's intervention, God's people will destroy the nations instantly and powerfully, like fire tearing through pine branches. So that's what God is going to do against his enemies as they gather to attack his people. And then we come to the fifth picture, which talks about what God will do for his people. And Zechariah's final image in this section is the person of David. Verses 7 to 9. And it's a wonderful picture. Imagine the people are discouraged. They're almost giving up. They're just about holding on to God's promises. Well, on that day, the Lord will make them as strong in faith as King David was. And that's exactly what will happen to us when Jesus returns. 1 John chapter 3 verse 2. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. So just as God's people in the Old Testament were going to be like David, so we too, when Jesus returns, will be like Jesus. What a great hope that is. Just stop and think about it for a moment. The very fact the Lord will destroy the enemies of his people, which means God's people, us, can enjoy rest and peace. You see, actually, you can't have one without the other. If you want rest and peace, God has got to take action against the enemies, and the Lord will destroy those enemies. But who are those enemies? Well, back in Zechariah's time, God's plan for his people was focused on the nation of Israel. So God's enemies were the nations surrounding Israel who fought against them. But in the New Testament onwards, God's enemies are all people who've not yet joined sides with Jesus. People who are not Christian. And then when is God going to destroy his enemies? Well, we said at the beginning, on that day I will, is used 14 times. So when is that day? Well, when we get to the New Testament, we can see that what Zechariah saw as that day opens out into what we call the last days. The days between Jesus' first coming 2,000 years ago and his second coming at some unknown date in the future. And that's now. It's the period we're living in now. Now, we do see Zechariah 12 being fulfilled to some degree between Jesus' first coming and his second coming in the work that the church is doing today. We perhaps don't see God's enemies being destroyed, but we do see them being overcome. And that's as Christians, you and I, share the message of Jesus in a hostile world, and the church grows. Yep, we're going to face persecution, but we continue to spread the good news about Jesus. But Zechariah 12 will finally be fulfilled when Jesus returns, when he comes in great power and suddenly and decisively destroys his enemies and brings comfort to his people. So let's be realistic though. The church will face opposition. Down the ages, all over the world, Christians have always faced persecution. And looking ahead in our own country into the future, it's likely that opposition and persecution is going to get stronger. But we need to remember what Jesus says in John chapter 15. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. So expect opposition. But the second thing is, be assured God will destroy the enemies of the church. We heard at the beginning just how great God is. So let's take to heart that there is no power on heaven or earth who can stop God from accomplishing his purposes. Because there is no enemy on heaven or in earth who is going to defeat God and destroy his people. God will destroy the enemies of his people. And be assured, the Lord Jesus will return to comfort his people and destroy their enemies.